Chapter 1. Myth of Hitler's Genius. Did he ever have a plan? Welcome to our deep dive on one of the most misunderstood characters of modern history, Sir Hans Hitler. This week, we're opening the first chapter of our series, 10 Common Myths, about Hitler, legends you mistook for facts. And we're going straight to the biggest one. The myth of Hitler's so-called genius. Was the problem of Adolf Hitler the heroic thunderbolt and genius governing leader and gifted odds, speaker of the popular myth, or was he something much less impressive, an accidental figurehead, in other words, propped up by accident, spin, and other people's brute force? Let's get this out of the way. Hitler was no moron, but genius. That's really overrating him. Let's dissect why. The source of the genius myth. The myth of Hitler's genius was created during his life and largely inflamed by his propaganda chief, Joseph Goebbels. Goebbels was instrumental in creating the image of Hitler as a military genius, a friend of the common man, a political seer. But what most people also forget is that this perception was not natural. It was manufactured. It worked. This aura of genius not only seduced a shattered Germany, it also confounded Allied leaders. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain famously misjudged Hitler, declaring him a reasonable man upon their meeting at Munich in 1938. Others viewed him as a man of a sort of demented brilliance. That story persisted long after the war. But let's take a look at the man behind the myth. 1. The failed artist before Führer. Hitler was a failed painter. He twice applied to the Academy of Fine Arts, Vienna, and was denied admission on both occasions. Why? Since his art was without human figures. So it's true, the ultimate genocider wasn't able to draw us human beings. He bounced between flophouses and sold third-rate postcard art to get by. But as a thinker, as a creator, he was a dud. It would be amusing if his failure as an artist were nothing but an interesting piece of trivia. It's crucial. It establishes the lens for viewing Hitler as not the product of personal genius, but of societal decay, media manipulation and expediency. 2. Military brilliance or dangerous gambles. Let's talk military strategy. Of course, for a while, Hitler was making some strong moves. The remilitarization of the Rhineland, the Anschluss with Austria, the absorption of the Sudetenland. All these things were politically daring, but they weren't genius. They were high-stakes bets in a geopolitical order that remained frozen by the trauma of World War I. The Western powers were so terrified of another war that they virtually handed him Czechoslovakia on a silver platter. That's not genius. That's gambling in a casino where the guards are taking a break as the merry war got underway in reality. Hitler's strategy continued to jump from one based on non-interference to one based on engaging, then wrecking the Soviet Union. He second-guessed his generals often, prioritizing his gut over professional judgment. Let's not forget Operation Barbarossa, invading the Soviet Union without the warm clothes or supply lines to do it. Disaster. Battle of Stalingrad. Fanatically insisting upon the defense of a city for its own sake. Catastrophic. Not allowing his armies to retreat or regroup when it made tactical sense. Pure hubris. A military genius does not lose a two-front war he created himself. 3. Political manipulator or just lucky. Hitler's ascent to power has so often been conceived as the triumph of a political virtuoso, playing his violin of the Weimar Republic with supreme skill. But historians today underscore how much his success boiled down to chance and the failures of others. He never secured a majority in a free election. Donald R. Burgett is charged that in the nomination and election of Adolf Hitler and in the 1932 election of Paul von Hindenburg, he first assisted in facility, then submitted to dictation to a fascist dictatorship. The Nazi Party gained power only in shadowy backroom deals. Hitler was chosen as chancellor, not elected. Everybody around him thought they could control him. Big mistake. And let's be clear, Hitler was not a public speaker, he was a performance artist. His speeches were fiery, dramatic, full of emotion and simplistic, filled with repetition, blame and slogans. It wasn't debatable. It was incitement. 4. The visionary with no vision. Hitler is often described as the man with a vision for the future of Germany. That's not true. He had vague utopian rhetoric and ridiculously detailed racial policies, but no viable economic or political plan. His demand for Lebensraum living space was not based on reason. It was a racist fever dream, pseudoscientific in basis. He thought that Germans had to colonize further east and enslave or exterminate those who lived there. That's not strategy, that's delusion. Hitler's will suppressed the best parts of him, restraint, and a matchless patience in the service of his long-term wish, and destroyed Europe, tens of millions of people, and Germany completely. A true genius sets themselves up for success. Hitler intended domination, and found himself in a bunker, blaming everybody else. Surrounded by real talent, Hitler is mistakenly given credit for the efficiency of the Nazi system, and in reality, he surrounded himself with competent, if frequently terrifying administrators. Heinrich Himmler, the SS Gestapo, his life and career. Albert Speer, the Nazi architect who oversaw weapons production with chilling efficiency, from Crown Prince Menzenbound. For historic forgery and moral bankruptcy, 325 CE Constantine desecration of European heritage, Joseph Goebbels propaganda, and public manipulation. Hitler did not create the Nazi machine, he rode it, and his leadership wasn't even clearly in charge of things when it was. It was chaotic, indecisive, and based on ideological obsessions, rather than practical considerations. Conclusion. Myth that deserves to die. So, why does the false notion of Hitler's genius endure? Because it's convenient. It puts evil at a remove, makes it alien, almost supernatural. If Hitler was a genius, at least we have nothing to fear from the average person doing what he did. But the scarier truth is, Hitler was no mastermind. He was an opportunist who surfed on a tide of anger, nationalism, economic misery, and propaganda. He didn't outwit his adversaries, he outweighed them. As this series goes on, we'll take off more of these layers. For understanding the truth about Hitler isn't merely about correcting the record. It is about understanding how dangerous myths can be, and of understanding how easily they can metastasize when unchallenged. Instead, let's start with one of the most enduringly bizarre myths about Adolf Hitler, that he was a peaceful, animal-loving vegetarian who held dogs, wildlife, and all that was non-violent close to his heart, while feeling abject horror about violence. It's a self-portrait that is grotesquely at odds with the blood-soaked reality of his regime, and you'd think it would have died a swift death in the public imagination after World War II, and yet it endures in documentaries, pop culture, and even casual conversation. So we should ask, was Hitler actually a peace-loving vegetarian who only had animals' best interests in mind? Or is this yet another myth, woven from a loose fabric of partial truths and a veritable mountain of spun propaganda? The vegetarian lie. Let's start with the diet. Yes, Hitler is often referred to as a vegetarian, yet the truth is far more. He reportedly steered clear of meat for health purposes, or, at times, on principle. According to his private chef Constanza Manzielli, according to him, he was suffering from gastrointestinal disorders, and vegetarian meals agreed with his sensitive stomach. But there are several eyewitness accounts of him eating sausages, stuffed pigeons, liver dumplings and ham, especially in the early years. So what gives? As was the case with so many things in Hitler's life, the vegetarian angle was largely propaganda. Joseph Goebbels and the Nazi propaganda machine presented it as evidence of his character as a disciplined, self-sacrificing, morally pure leader. Yet Hitler's life with food was a much more complicated one that centered on hypochondria and image manipulation, not genuine ethical concern. It should be added that he didn't mind feeding meat to his dog, or sending millions of people to be slaughtered. It's an odd sort of vegetarianism. Hitler's love for animals is. Hitler enacted several laws in the 1930s that aimed to protect animals. The Nazis outlawed animal cruelty in movies, regulated animal testing and placed restrictions on hunting. 1933, the Reich Animal Protection Act, one of the first national laws regulating the rights of animals. But hold off, before you start passing out the vegan awards. These laws were highly propagandized, arbitrarily enforced, and frequently hypocritical. This is the same regime that made it a crime to kill lobsters by boiling them alive, but tested chemical weapons in living dogs and monkeys. It was not a love of animals, it was aesthetics. The Nazis loved wolves, eagles, and other symbols of power, purity, and primal might. They hated pests and vermin, words they later applied to Jews, Roma, and disabled people. Animal welfare was never about empathy. It was about ideology, the mystique of the gentle pacifists. Next, one is almost comical if it were not so perilous. The notion that Hitler was a pacifist in some morally bizarre sense is totally upside down. But it was the outgrowth of early Nazi propaganda that had Hitler being a man who only wanted peace for Germany if the rest of the world would stop bullying them. In fact, Hitler was mad for war right from the start. He called war not only necessary but noble in Mein Kampf. Everything in his political philosophy was about struggle, domination, winning. The Nazis saw a romance in death in battle, deified martyrdom, and created a culture of violence. Their paramilitary arm, the SA, was nothing more than a stooged-up gang. Violence as state policy went a step further with the SS. Let's be absolutely clear on this. Hitler was not a reluctant warrior. He wanted it. He planned for it. He built a regime around it. 4 dogs, Eva Braun, and a deliberately cultivated misapprehension. One reason for this myth is Hitler's immaculately prepared public image. He was frequently pictured with his favorite dog, German Shepherd, Blondie. He would show up in propaganda films strolling in the mountains, feeding deer and chatting quietly with children. It was pure optics. The aim was to humanize a man whose policies were anything but. And so these representations helped construct an illusion of a loving, peaceful, meditative leader. It made him seem human and non-threatening, even charming. Eva Braun's home movies, for example, portray a man laughing and playing with dogs, but such private photos were, more often than not, staged or strategically released. Meanwhile, a man who nurtured Blondie with his own hands mandated the systematic extermination of millions, the starvation of whole populations, and the bombardment of civilian areas. Nazi environmentalism. Another smokescreen. Some say the Nazis were early conservationists, with precedent-setting measures protecting forests, animals, and fighting pollution. Here's the thing. Whatever environmental policies existed under the Third Reich had nothing to do with being good stewards of the environment. They were about advancing the nationalist and racial agenda of the regime. The land was holy only to the extent that it was considered German. Conservation was about strengthening the Volk, not preserving ecosystems for their own sake. For instance, one of the things the Nazis liked about forests was that they could be seen to symbolize Aryan purity, and also because they provided resources for war. Tribes prized blood and soil ideology, binding people to the land, but also didn't mind devastating other lands with scorched earth. Selective sympathy. Another reason the myth of Hitler's soft side endures is psychological. The prospect someone so monstrously violent could also be affectionate, to animals at least, is difficult for people to take in. It creates cognitive dissonance. How can a guy who cooed over puppies have brought about the Holocaust? That dissonance compels people to raise certain isolated facts to the level of defining characteristics. But the ability to feel the broad range of emotions isn't the same as being a morally virtuous person. Serial killers have pets too. Hitler's supposed soft spot for animals doesn't make him sympathetic. It just shows that even monsters can reserve a few corners inside themselves where the rats can scamper. Conclusion. Dangerous nonsense. The myth of Hitler as peaceful animal. Vegetarian has one purpose. It is designed to make the dictator seem less of a monster, and that's incredibly dangerous. It affords people an in, a sinecure of relativization. Well, he wasn't so bad. Let's be blunt. Hitler was not a vegetarian in any coherent or consistent way. He wasn't ethical in his love of animals, and he was not, under any circumstances, a pacifist. The truth matters. For when we begin to believe in myths, even little ones, we make it possible to whitewash horror. Hitler doesn't need humanizing. We need understanding to recognize the symptoms, the signs, when history starts to rhyme. Today in 10 common myths about Hitler, legends you mistook for facts, we're returning to our series on misconceptions about the FRA. In this chapter, we're going to tear into one of the most mythologized and most dangerous fallacies, that the German people were united in adoring Adolf Hitler. You have most likely seen the old footage. Huge, cheering, saluting, flower-tossing crowds. Hitler up on a balcony like a rock star basking in an ocean of adulation. It's an image that has been carved into the collective consciousness. A nation under a spell, worshipping its leader as a god. But here's the uncomfortable truth. That image was as carefully staged as a modern influencer's Instagram feed. Finally, Hitler's approval was nowhere near as omnipresent as Nazi propaganda or lackadaisical pop history would like for you to believe. 1. The power of propaganda. Hitler's myth of populist appeal is thanks in no small part to Joseph Goebbels and the Nazi propaganda machine. Goebbels knew something horrifyingly effective: when perception is reality. When you inundate the public with images of adulation on the part of the masses, by adoring masses, and posters depicting the Führer as a messianic figure, and headlines preening in his triumphs. People begin to believe the hype, or at any rate are too scared to openly doubt it. Radio, film, newspapers, posters, schoolbooks, all of it was commandeered into the Nazi PR campaign. The gist was indisputable. Everybody loves Hitler. So if you didn't, you were the weirdo, or worse, a traitor. It's classic authoritarian playbook stuff. Drowned the truth in a tidal wave of narrative. The myth of the landslide. Let's look at the numbers. Under no circumstances did Hitler ever win a majority. In a fair election, he lost to the sitting president, Paul von Hindenburg, who received only about 36% of the overall vote. Even at the peak of the Nazi Party's electoral success, the July 1932 parliamentary elections, they managed to win only about 37% of the vote. That's not a landslide. That's not universal love. That's a broken country, thirsting for change and fatally divided. The only reason Hitler became chancellor was a series of backroom deals among conservative elites who believed they could control him. Spoiler alert, they couldn't. 3. Fear does not equal popularity once in office. Hitler and the Nazis moved quickly to stomp out resistance. Political opponents, particularly communists and social democrats, were rounded up, incarcerated, or executed. Trade unions were banned. The media was muzzled or co-opted. Open dissent was the crime of death or a one-way trip to the concentration camp. So, if you're wondering why so few people protested, it's because protesting got you killed. And when you watch those movies with cheering throngs, remember, some of those cheers were fake. Some were coerced, and many were people just trying to get by. In a police state, this is a command. It's fear. Greek-born, former Hitler Youth member. I see culture war in America. Am terrified opinion by Wolfgang Fuchs. Updated 07-8 GMT Sribuli Maratus Duoplud Lapan Hakate. February 20th, 2020. Wolfgang Fuchs. Conservative Christians and members of the anti-abortion movement are being pitted against pro-choice and pro-abortion advocates. Another reason Hitler seemed popular. He started grooming loyalty early. By the late 1930s, membership in the Hitler Youth for Boys and the League of German Girls for Girls had become mandatory. Children were inundated with Nazi ideology, racial purity, fidelity to the Führer, the magnificence of war. They were not programs for civic engagement. They were brainwashing camps with outfits and marching drills. By the time these kids reached adulthood, normal had been so distorted for them. Quite a few really did spend many of their formative years believing that Hitler was awesome. His peers' approval of him wasn't popularity, it was indoctrination. 5. The dissent that was and wasn't there were, nevertheless, opponents. Despite the dangers, and it wasn't just from fringe radicals or foreign agents, religious leaders, such as Britain's Dietrich Bonhoeffer, freely criticized Hitler and gave their lives in return. Student organizations such as the White Rose circulated anti-Nazi pamphlets in Munich, and in the military itself there were plans to assassinate Hitler. Most famously the Valkyrie plot of July 20th, 1944, led by Klaus von Stauffenberg. These weren't enemies of the state. They were Germans, war veterans among them, who had seen through the lie. Their folly is the myth that Hitler was universally beloved, a narrative that whitewashes their courage and hides the truth. Propaganda. Footage is not a Polet's. Start with the big visual elephant in the room. All those rallies, yes, they were real. Yes, people really showed up. But they were tightly choreographed, selectively filmed and designed to look bigger and more enthusiastic than they typically were. They came for all reasons: peer pressure, curiosity, fear, some kind of compelled participation. It's why people who are in cults have such brilliant smiles in their photos. Optics and support are not one and the same. Also, if you didn't come, somebody knew and asked questions, and possibly put people on your doorstep. Wartime popularity, fact or fantasy. Hitler did experience a surge of popularity early in World War II. Why? Because Germany was winning. The lightning conquest of Poland, France and the Low Countries installed in people the erroneous estimate that Hitler was a genius. But once things started to turn, Stalingrad, North Africa, D-Day, the public mood turned sour. Rationing, air raids and rising casualties wore away at those smiles. The response of the regime was more censorship, more executions and greater control. A true leader lives on trust. Hitler thrived on silence. The cult of personality isn't the same as popularity cults. Of personality are the dictator's favorite political ruse, because they enable fear to masquerade as love. Every household, school, and office in Nazi Germany had Hitler's image. People had to say Heil Hitler to one another. His songs of praise were led in classes by teachers. His speeches were played constantly on the radio. Dissent was not merely frowned on, it was deadly. This isn't mass approval. This is mass psychological warfare. Love, built on lies whatever love some may have held for Hitler, was based on a volcano of lies. The Jews were ruining Germany. The economy boomed under Nazi rule. Hitler craved peace. The Reich was invincible. These lies were created, repeated, and institutionalized, and when the truth started to peek out, it was either discounted or beaten down. Conclusion: popularity by illusion. So, was Hitler actually popular with the people? Some did admire him fanatically, but many others were deceived, intimidated, or just trying to stay alive. Both Hobsbawm and Bourdieu, products of a time when the state was a semi-venerable institution, understood this. His popularity was a toxic brew of propaganda, coercion, indoctrination, and illusion. Let's not confuse fear with fandom. Crowds of cheerers can be bought, or bullied, or brainwashed. In a free society, real popularity doesn't require secret police and concentration camps. And in the next chapter, we'll unravel another long-standing myth. The economic miracle. Did Hitler really fix Germany's economy? Buckle in, because that story is riddled with more holes than Swiss cheese. Welcome back to Chapter 4 of our myth-busting series, 10 Common Myths about Hitler, Legends You Mistook for Facts, in which we do away with the lies, half-truths, and misconceptions that have shaped the Hitler story so far. And today, we're tackling an assertion that's been bandied about in history books, barroom debates, and way too many internet forums. At least Hitler fixed the economy. You've likely heard it before, typically as some sort of devil's bargain. Okay, he did evil things, but he helped Germany climb out of the Great Depression. It's a half-true argument, one that lies with statistics, and one that conveniently erases the real human cost. Let's unpack it, slowly, brutally, thoroughly. Context: a broken Germany was in terrible shape, and when Hitler came to power, in 1933, it seemed for many Germans as if things just might be turning around. The Great Depression had ravaged world economies, and the Treaty of Versailles had saddled Germany with crippling reparations, territorial losses, and national humiliation. Unemployment was at 30%. Bread lines were long. Factories were shut. It was the Weimar Republic on the brink. And that's when Hitler entered the picture, not with magical economic genius, but with fiery rhetoric, scapegoats, and a couple of dirty tricks thrown in. The miracle of the economy, or just spending. Massive money by J.B. The most recent GDP numbers surprised really only one group of people, the gang of economic hooligans, known in America as Democrats. The economic miracle was not that miraculous after all. It was old-school Keynesian economics on steroids. With a fascist twist. Here's what the Nazis did. Vast government spending on public works. Think the Autobahn. These initiatives created jobs and infrastructure. Armament. More billions were poured into weapons factories, tank plants, and a host of military expansion. Secret deficit spending. The Nazis borrowed massively, often through secret mechanisms like MIFO bills, to pay for their build-up. The result: unemployment did fall. The economy did grow, but not without military expansion, financial trickery, and a coming war. Hitler didn't invent this formula. He put it on, or cranked it up, consequences be damned, and sold it like a boss. 3. The numbers of employment, cooked and cajoled. His official unemployment numbers dropped. But when we popped the hood, women were kicked out of the workplace, told their place was in the home raising Aryan babies. Jews and political dissidents were barred from numerous professions. Millions were drafted in the military or into labor service. The rest were put to work in concentration camps, forced labor camps, and factories. So sure, fewer people were officially out of work, but many had been, or were, turned into forced labor, thrown in jail, or scrubbed from the books. It's really not that hard to claim low unemployment if you get to decide who counts as employed, and who gets counted at all. The price of repression. The Nazi economic machine wasn't just fueled by steel and oil. It was fueled also by fear. Wages were tightly controlled. Trade unions were abolished. Strikes were illegal. The German Labour Front replaced free labour representation with an organization which meekly rubber-stamped a view of life, economy, and society described, in the words, writings, and ideas of Hitler. Workers lost rights, protections and bargaining power. They were guaranteed a Volkswagen people's car that almost nobody at all got. They were spoon-fed propaganda about national unity and prosperity, and kept under the heel, smoke, mirrors, and unsustainable death. The Nazi economic engine was revving, but it was out of time and out of money. With the help of MIFO Bill's secret promissory notes, the scheme borrowed huge sums off the... This let them spend a lot more than they would have been able to without it showing up on the books. It was, in effect, a Ponzi scheme based on militarization and expansion. The reasoning was, conquer new lands, rob their resources, and use that to pay off the debt. Spoiler, it didn't work. When the war began to go against Germany, the entire system collapsed. There was no such thing as this so-called miracle. It was a rickety facade, designed to collapse. The human price, slave labor, and plunder. The Nazis looted the resources of the countries they invaded, enslaved their people, and sent the plunder back to the Reich. More than 13 million people were enslaved as forced labor from captured territories. Art, gold, and other valuables were looted with great precision. There were mass confiscations of Jewish property, which was Aryanized. This wasn't economic genius, it was vampirism. Yet without the support of the war machine and empire, Hitler's economy could not have lasted another 5 years. It was not a fix, it was a fire sale. The Volksgemeinschaft delusion, part of the reason the myth of the miracle endures, is simply delusion of wealth. Nazi propaganda depicted a harmonious, hard-working society united in a common cause. But this was propaganda. The Nazi economy left its spoils unevenly distributed. If you were Aryan, male, and politically conformist, you might appreciate the charade, but everyone else, exploited or eliminated. Behind a smiling Aryan family in a Volkswagen AD was a concentration camp inmate who had been ordered at gunpoint to mine coal. Post-war Germany proves the point that's not even the kicker. Real, sustainable recovery didn't happen under Hitler. It happened after him. West Germany, rebuilt with the aid of the Marshall Plan and rooted in democratic capitalism, grew to be one of the world's most successful economies. No wars, no slaves, no loot, just invention, trade, and social improvement. That's the real economic miracle, and there was not a trace of the Third Reich in it. Conclusion: the myth of prosperity. So no, Hitler didn't fix the economy. He duct-taped it and militarized it and drove it at top speed into a cliff. Its temporary gains were achieved at immense human and moral cost, and they could not last. This myth has stubborn legs because it makes history easy, because it shows that even horror has its silver linings, but mass murder has no upside. Asterisk. No, but at least Hitler didn't fix anything. He broke everything. In Chapter 5 coming up, the creative visionary. Was Hitler a real genius? Let's see if his paintings and architectural dreams were really worth the hype, or just more smoke and mirrors. Stay tuned. Welcome to Chapter 5 of our continuing series, 10 Common Myths about Hitler, Legends You Thought Were True. Today's subject, the myth of Hitler as an unappreciated artistic genius, a failed visionary whose artistic yearnings and architecture that went unmade, or a painting that found no buyers were thwarted by the powers that be. Let's be blunt. Hitler had artistic ambitions, but again, his talent, not so much. The fact is, his creative ambitions were mediocre at best, and dangerously delusional at worst. So how has this myth arose about the artistic visionary, and why does it still linger? Dig into Hitler's sketchpad, look into his architectural fantasies, and decode the twisted aesthetic that formed the literal and ideological underpinning for the Nazi regime. Hitler, the art school, reject first the facts. Hitler applied to the Academy of Fine Arts, Vienna, on 2 occasions, in 1907 and then in 1908. He was rejected both times. Why? This was because of his lack of originality and skill, and his inability to draw human beings with any great degree of realism. His portfolio was filled with sketches of architectural facades and bland city scenes. Commentators said his work was dead and uninspired and lacked any human feeling. But the Academy encouraged him to think about architecture instead. Even so, at the time, Hitler didn't have the secondary education in math and engineering that most architectural programs required. He didn't pivot, he pouted, and that bitterness, it turned into a lifelong resentment of elites, intellectuals, and cultural institutions. Rejection didn't humble him, it radicalized him. Was his art really that bad? Let's not sugarcoat it. Hitler's paintings were skillful in the way that a good amateur might be, but absolutely uninspired. They're the visual equivalent of Musak. He had some sense of perspective, architectural lines, but no soul, no experimentation, no people. Even in landscapes, the human touch was hardly ever present. Like he could articulate the shell of a world, but not the heart, she said. Art historians concur. Hitler's work isn't anything special. If he hadn't been a dictator, his paintings would have turned up in flea markets or old attic boxes. The real Chim Chim Sherry, How to Stubbed Toes, and Nazis influence Mary Poppins guest blog. Though Hitler turned out to be an unsuccessful artist to his dying day, his aesthetic obsessions never left him. Once in charge, he inflected his artistic taste everywhere. Posters, uniforms, movies, sculptures, buildings. Nazi art was all idealized human forms. Heroic posing, muscularity, glowing Aryan faces. Think Greek statues, but on steroids, and with a fascist glare. He had a hatred of modernism, abstract art, avant-gardism. He called it degenerate art, and it wasn't just an insult but a purge. Thousands of these works of art were seized, destroyed, or sold to pay for the regime. Artists were banned, jailed, killed. So Hitler's taste in art was more than a personal it was official state policy. He wasn't merely a realist rather than an abstract painter. He weaponized aesthetics in the service of his ideology of racial purity, of architectural order, of power. Architecture as ideology. And now let's track onto Hitler's favorite canvas, the buildings. In his dreams, Berlin would become Germania, a super-imperial megacity full of marble monstrosities and massive domes and halls that could have swallowed cathedrals whole. With his chief architect, Albert Speer, he conceived plans that would have made ancient Rome seem modest. These were projects less of function than of symbolism. Hitler thought architecture could convey power, control, and eternal order. Every column, every plaza, every arch was designed to shout, "We will endure for 1,000 years." Spoiler alert, they lasted 12. Some of the designs were so huge they were literally unbelievable. They had warned engineers that Hitler's proposed Great Hall would fall under its own weight. He didn't care. It wasn't real. It was a spectacle, the myth of the sensitive soul. Much of this myth has its roots in a romanticized view of Hitler's early life, the impoverished artist in a Vienna flophouse, tossing breadcrumbs to pigeons, wandering galleries, feeling the world has misunderstood him. It casts him as a tragic figure, an unheeded visionary of whom society is unworthy. But this story lasciviously oversimplifies the man and whitewashes the monster. Yes, Hitler liked Wagner. Yes, he visited museums. But so what? You don't have to be some kind of idealistic visionary just because you like classical music. It doesn't justify your hatred, your crimes, your ideology. Art didn't tame Hitler. It didn't humanize him. It was something else in his arsenal. The reality behind the ruins most of Hitler's grand architectural dreams came to nothing. The war drained resources. His concrete utopia was largely reduced to rubble from bombing by the Allies. What was built, from the Zeppelin field in Nuremberg to the massive Tempelhof airport, turned into spooky remnants, merely empty carapaces of a deluded empire. Today, many of these places are retained not as sites for adulation, but for remembrance of what takes place when aesthetics are leveraged to beautify nightmare. Art as propaganda. Hitler's most profound influence on art may have been the way he altered it. Film was a vital form of propaganda under Goebbels, and of course there is the infamous Triumph of the Will by Leni Riefenstahl, still one of the most technically brilliant, as well as morally vile, films ever made. Visuals weren't just decoration, they were doctrine. The Nazi regime grasped that emotion. Myth and beauty could be weaponized so that evil would appear as noble. Conclusión a la vista que lo emponzona todo so. Was Hitler a creative genius? No. He was a mediocre painter with delusions of grandeur who used art not to express truth or explore humanity, but to dominate and dehumanize. His taste was totalitarian, straight lines, iron discipline, no space for difference. The myth of the visionary is a seductive one because it implies complexity. But complexity doesn't equal brilliance, and this, in Hitler's case, was never about creativity. It was about control. Welcome to Chapter 6 of 10 Common Myths about Hitler. Legends you thought were true. Today we're knocking down one of the most deadly lies ever told. The lie that Hitler was reluctant to become an anti-Semite, or, even worse, that he was somehow forced into it by the political culture of his time. Make no mistake. Let's be clear from the jump. There was nothing accidental, reluctant, or reactive in Hitler's hatred of Jews. Well before he ascended to power, it was central to his worldview, his politics, and his sense of identity. It didn't stem from some late-breaking radicalization. It wasn't a phase. It was the toxin at the root of all of it. So how did this myth begin? And why do so many people still believe it? Let's map the path of Hitler's from street stall rantings to state-sponsored genocide. The Vienna years, where the hate took root. Hitler's years in Vienna, 1908 to 13, are significant. This is where a young Adolf, destitute and resentful, stewed in a toxic brew of pan-German nationalism, conspiracy theories, and pseudoscience of race. Anti-Semitism wasn't lurking in the shadows, it was above the fold. Right-wing newspapers, demagogues and pamphleteers fulminated about Jewish influence, racial degeneracy, and cultural decadence. Hitler soaked it all in. His hero was Karl Lueger, the anti-Semitic mayor of Vienna, who used fears of racial contamination to win votes. He read every crackpot theory ever invented about Jewish finance, media, and culture. According to his own memoir, Mein Kampf, it was around this time that he became obsessed with the Jews, no longer as just a religion or ethnicity, but as a racial plague. That's not reluctant, that's rabid. The myth of the late-blooming bigoters insists that Hitler's anti-Semitism only really hardened after World War I, that his wartime service, in some way, opened his eyes to a Jewish conspiracy. But there's nothing to support this theory. In fact, few of his fellow soldiers at the time remembered him as much of a political bomb thrower. However much a loner or a bit of a weirdo some of them considered him. That's not proof of neutrality. It just means he didn't have a platform. Yet, when Germany lost the war and was forced to pay reparations and accept humiliating sanctions, Hitler didn't just grieve the defeat. He blamed the Jews for it. He embraced the stab-in-the-back myth, therefore, which falsely held that Germany lost, not through military defeat, but through internal betrayal by Jews and communists. This became his obsession, his origin story, the center of his ideology, and that was the power dream. Mein Kampf, a blueprint for hate. If you're looking for the direct line to Hitler's anti-Semitic soul, crack open Mein Kampf. It's a paranoid rant-fest in which Jews are depicted as corruptors, plotters, and existential enemies of German purity and power. He doesn't whisper it, he screams it. Jews are the embodiment of the devil. They are parasites eating at culture and economy. He thinks about them being taken away, even suggesting they be annihilated. This wasn't campaign rhetoric, it wasn't political theater, it was a blueprint. Everybody who read Mein Kampf in the 1920s knew what he thought. People didn't think very seriously about it, and that is part of the tragedy. Scapegoats and strategy. Now, some defenders of the reluctant anti-Semite narrative suggest that Hitler only exploited anti-Semitism for political purposes, that he was just surfing the wave of populism and anger. Wrong. He wasn't following the crowd. He was leading it ferociously. Yes, anti-Semitism was rampant in Europe, but Hitler weaponized it as it had never before been. It wasn't just that he made Jews a scapegoat. He transformed them into the mainstay of his political campaign. He stuck the blame on them for every problem: economic malaise, moral slackening, political instability, and he didn't back off once in power. He doubled down. From the Great Land to the death camps with Hitler's appointment as Chancellor in 1933, ideology turned quickly into policy. Jews were banished from government, academia, and culture. Nuremberg laws removed their citizenship. Businesses were boycotted, synagogues vandalized, books banned. This wasn't improvisation, it was implementation. By the time Kristallnacht came around in 1938, when Jewish homes, businesses, and synagogues were attacked in a violent spree, it was clear where this thing was headed. And then, ghettos, mass shootings, gas vans, death trains, Auschwitz. The final solution didn't just happen. It was the horrifying end to decades of ideological build-up. The myth that hides complicity. So, where did the reluctant narrative come from? Because it sanitizes the past. It humanizes Hitler, makes him less of a monster. It gives people the freedom to think. He didn't actually mean it, or he was only a man of his times. It also shifts blame. If Hitler was only about being an anti-Semite, maybe Germany wasn't too bad. Perhaps the Holocaust was an accident of history, not part of a purposeful effort. But that's false, and it's dangerous. A warning from history, knowing that Hitler's anti-Semitism ran deep, was conscious, and took decades to cultivate, is important. Not just in order to set the record straight, but to be alert. Bigotry doesn't always scream. Sometimes it simmers. It is disguised by charm, euphemism, or policy. And left unchallenged, it metastasizes. Hitler wasn't reluctantly anti-Semitic. He was proudly, obsessively so. And he made a regime and a genocide based on that obsession. Conclusion. Hatred was the point. Let's be absolutely clear. Anti-Semitism was not some esoteric sideline in the worldview of Hitler. It was the headline. It wasn't a tool. It was the destination. He didn't come to hatred on a reluctant tide. He sprinted toward it, arms outstretched, eyes wide. This is Chapter 7 of our series 10 Common Myths about Hitler. Legends you thought were true. This time we're cutting through another tough yet insidiously misleading narrative. The notion that Hitler was a unique evil, a one-man horror show who single-handedly caused Germany and the world to go insane. A sinister genius tugging on all the strings himself, and with no true support. It's a cinematic idea. One man, one monster, one mind that held it all together. But it's not history, it's a fairy tale. For the chilling reality is this: Hitler wasn't alone. He had help. A lot of it. From bureaucrats and generals to scientists, business leaders, and ordinary people. The Nazi regime wasn't a one-man show. It was a group effort. And that understanding is central to understanding how genocides occur. The myth of the puppet master-teller was the figurehead, the dictator, the Führer, but he did not micromanage the entire Third Reich. Despite the myth, he wasn't seated at a giant chessboard himself, deciding every death camp and military move. He provided the ideological fire, the hateful vision, but the machinery. That was constructed, maintained, and operated by thousands of willing hands. He wasn't a puppet master, he was the spark. The crowd brought the fuel, the inner circle, true believers and cutthroat operators. Hitler's inner circle, brainless, brown-nosing fanatics who thought their leader's insane beliefs and genocidal dream had been sent down to them on tablets of stone, and carried out the master race madman's demented and deranged orders, not dying, most of them, until the war was nearly lost and there was no hope that they would become his martyrs. Heinrich Himmler led the SS, and in charge of the organizing the Holocaust, one of the most effective propaganda machines in history, was run by Joseph Goebbels. The Luftwaffe was led by Hermann Göring, who was instrumental in structuring economic plunder. Albert Speer, Hitler's architect and then armaments minister, made the Nazi war machine more efficient. Essentially, he streamlined the same beast. These weren't mindless drones, they were true believers, technocrats, and yes, a few were frighteningly effective bureaucrats. They were not scared. A good many of them were convicted. Bureaucrats of death. The Holocaust was not an act of spontaneous insanity. It was a huge logistical effort. Trains had to be scheduled, ghettos organized, death camps staffed. And who made that happen? Middle managers, civil servants, policemen, railway clerks, and Adolf Eichmann, a mid-level bureaucrat, organized the transport of millions to their deaths. At his trial, he testified that he was just following orders, but he wasn't reluctant. He was disturbingly methodical. That's the horror. Genocide doesn't need maniacs. It only takes people who won't take no. The responsibility of the army, and not innocent bystanders after the war. A number of German generals insisted that they were apolitical and had no part in Nazi criminal acts. That's nonsense. The Wehrmacht, the regular army, cheered him on, at least until the tides of war shifted. They pledged personal loyalty to him. They were involved in invasions, mass shootings, and the annihilation of civilian populations. And when the SS required assistance in killing Jews in the East, the army often lent a hand. This wasn't just Hitler's war, it was their war. To corporate complicity, profits before people ate. Major corporations not only survived under Nazi rule, they flourished. IG Farben provided the Auschwitz gas. Forced labor was used by Volkswagen, Daimler-Benz, Siemens, and Other companies, banks, laundered looted property from Jewish dissidents. Business leaders weren't coerced, they cooperated, for profit, for prestige, sometimes out of shared ideology. The industrial motor of genocide was driven by capitalism, with its conscience switched off. Scientific servants of the state of science wasn't spared. Nazi doctors and researchers promoted eugenics, carried out ghoulish human experiments, and played a key role in justifying Nazi persecution and extermination of those considered inferior. Children were subjected to experiments by Joseph Mengele, the notorious angel of death. Physicians approved euthanasia programs focused on those with disabilities. They weren't mad scientists. They were technicians of destruction, using their talents for evil. Ordinary men. The willing executioners. This is where the myth starts. To crack wide open, the Holocaust required guards, informers, looters, and neighbors who looked the other way, or looked the other way, while turning people in. The historian Christopher Browning's Ordinary Men deals with the speed with which quite ordinary German policemen became mass murderers. Many weren't coerced. They volunteered, and in occupied Europe, locals often joined in. Denunciations, looting. The fantasy that everyone was an innocent or resistor is a fallacy. The solace of the lonely monster. Myth. Why does the lone madman story persist? Because it comforts us. It isolates evil in one man, makes it feel out of the ordinary, like something unique and unrepeatable. But the truth is scarier. The Holocaust took place, not despite normal systems, governments, economic entities, social organizations functioning just as they were supposed to, just under evil leadership. That's why the myth must die. Evil isn't always extraordinary. Sometimes, it's mundane. Conclusion. A Village for the Reich. Hitler wasn't a solo act. He was the frontman for a machine far larger, one that needed millions to operate. He inspired, he commanded, but others also designed, constructed, carried out, and enabled. The lesson: never let tyranny have just one name, because when we do, we start to forget how average people helped us get here. Welcome to Chapter 8 of 10 Common Myths about Hitler, Legends You Thought Were True. This chapter wades into one of the most difficult and contentious questions of all. Was Adolf Hitler a Christian? Was he ever a defender of the faith, as some astonishingly still say? Let's get this out of the way immediately. No, Hitler was not a devout Christian. He was by no means a champion of Christianity, and he was most certainly not fighting in defense of Christian values. Not only is the notion that Hitler was a pious believer or religious zealot historically wrong, it is downright dangerous. But, like any good lie, this one has a smidgen of truth in it. Let's unpick it. The God talk in public. Hitler had frequently used religious-sounding phraseology in his speeches. He mentioned divine providence. He threw around the word God a lot. He had even said that his mission was from some higher power. All of it, however, was part of the act. Hitler, however, knew well religion's rhetorical force in a country that was still largely Christian. He covered his politics with a mantle of moral righteousness, invoking God, but forgetting about the legal issue. There is a huge difference between using God for a talking point and truly believing. This wasn't theology, it was branding. Private views, hostile and heretically in private. However, Hitler expressed very different opinions about Christianity. In many private conversations recorded in sources such as Hitler's Table Talk, he trivialized Christianity as a rebellion against natural law, a Jewish invention, an absurdity. He admired paganism and ancient Germanic mythology, and even the martial discipline of Islam. In his eyes, Christianity was effeminate, passive, and corrupt. I think he thought it promoted compassion and humility, two traits he loathed. His long-term plan: to make Christianity more and more ineffective in German life, and to lead to its disappearance. The Nazi-Church relationship, complicated and coercive. Nazis didn't make immediate war on the Church. They infiltrated and corrupted it. They invented a state-friendly form of Protestantism, the German Christian movement, which combined Nazi dogma with Christian symbolism. They attempted to recast Jesus as an Aryan warrior who fought Jews seriously. Meanwhile, the community of independent churches, primarily Catholics, experienced growing oppression. Priests were arrested, youth ministries were disbanded, religious schools were shut down. The Nazis made a covenanted agreement with the Vatican in 1933 and almost immediately violated it. Treaties were temporary arrangements, not sacred obligations. To Hitler. The Positive Christianity Scam in the Early Nazi Party Platform 31, page 1920 program. There's a line about uniting to support positive Christianity. Sounds pious, right? Wrong. Positive Christianity was a generalized term that was constructed to mean whatever the Nazis wanted it to mean. It had nothing to do with theology or belief. It was creating an anti-church apostolic church, divorced yet from Old Testament. Jewish heritage, the remaining Jewishness of Christ. It was, in effect, de-Christianized Christianity, stripped of its Jewish roots and repurposed to provide sacred sanction for Nazi racial doctrine. The long game. De-Christianized are in agreement that Hitler's long-term plan was to replace Christianity with a new Nazi religion based on blood, soil, race, and loyalty to the Führer. Christian holidays were recast with pagan imagery. Swastikas replaced crosses in churches. Even Christmas was Nazified with Aryan saints and runic emblems. The Nazis sought obedience, not redemption. They wanted fealty to the state, not faith in God. Resistance from within the church even under Nazi pressure. Not all Christians went quietly. Brave voices did speak up. Protestant pastor Dietrich Bonhoeffer challenged the regime and was executed. Bishop von Galen of Munster spoke out against the Nazi euthanasia program. Many underground networks assisted Jews in escaping, often guided by religious conviction. So while a few clergy caved in or worked with the Nazis, many others did not. Their resistance is evidence that Christianity and Nazism were never really inseparable. The myth's menacing legacy, the notion that Hitler was a champion of Christianity, is still pursued in fringe circles, and at times in attempts to redeem or rehabilitate him. Let's be very clear. Hitler would manipulate religion. He did not honor it. He twisted its language, hijacked its symbols, and they sought, in fact, to obliterate its very nature. Conclusion. Not a man of faith, but a user of it. So, no, Hitler was not a Christian in any meaningful sense. He was a political operator who applied religious imagery to hawk a fascist vision. His real convictions were anti-Christian, anti-clerical, and anti-religious. This mythology of the pious Führer just doesn't wash. It holds poison. Welcome to Chapter 9 of our continuing series, 10 Common Myths about Hitler, Legends You Thought Were True. Today, we're looking at another monumentally stupid lie. The notion that Adolf Hitler was generally, universally regarded as a military genius, a tactical miracle worker who almost single-handedly took over all of Europe by sheer force of strategic transcendence. Here's the truth. Hitler was no master of military strategy. He was a micromanager with a savior complex, whose decisions veered between erratic and emotionally driven. He disregarded his generals, pursued pipe dreams, and converted early strategic advantages into epic pratfalls. Here's how the myth originated, and why it is as dead as the Reich it describes. The early Blitzkrieg myth. Hitler's reputation as a military genius is mostly built on the early years of World War II. The swift defeat of Poland, 1939. The debacle of France, 1940. Early success in the Balkans and North Africa. But credit where credit is due. These victories were not the result of Hitler's masterful strategy. They were the product of brilliant military leaders and the employment of a type of blitzkrieg warfare, lightning attacks, using mixed forces that quickly overwhelmed ill-prepared adversaries. France didn't fall because Hitler was cleverer than them, but rather because they were strategically overconfident, encumbered by obsolete defenses, high Maginot Line, and suffered from some pretty severe domestic political dysfunction. Hitler's contribution, largely emphasizing that speed and aggression, trumped logistics or sustainability. Barbarossa, the delusion of invincibility operation, Barbarossa. Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941 is frequently represented as one of the worst strategic miscalculations in military history. He underestimated Soviet resilience. He divided his forces and switched objectives in the middle of a campaign. He began the invasion too late in the year and without adequate winter gear. Hitler thought the USSR would fall very soon. When it didn't, he doubled down on failure, issuing tactical retreats and valuing ideological goals like the capture of Stalingrad more highly than the need to win. He didn't listen to advice, he didn't adapt, and though his illusion of invincibility froze, literally and figuratively, when the Eastern Front did more than the mention of him to make my grandfather reach for his whiskey. Micromanagement. Madness. One of Hitler's greatest strategic mistakes was his compulsion for trying to run everything himself. As the war persisted, he more and more overrode his generals and began to personally run operations. He denied them retreats, thus encirclements and mass losses. He called shots from bunkers hundreds of miles off the battlefield. He was surrounded by yes-men, and when he wasn't, he often sacked competent generals who dared talk back. Halder, Guderian, Rommel, etc. A real military genius supports specialization. Hitler silenced it. North Africa and the mirage of Rommel, the desert fox, was made into a Nazi propaganda icon. His initial successes in North Africa appeared to demonstrate German military superiority, but Rommel too was limited by Hitler's disastrous strategic priorities. Supplies were inadequate. Objectives were unclear. Hitler was so obsessed with the Eastern Front that backing was refused. Rommel's drive finally collapsed, not as a result of his personal mistakes, but because Hitler viewed the North African campaign as a sideshow. Fortress Europe and the failed logical mishmash of contradictory ideas and paranoid blunders. That was Hitler's grand strategy to drive the Allied invasion back from France in the summer of 1944. He wouldn't accept that the Normandy landings were happening and believed that was a decoy. He delayed releasing panzer reinforcements. He was fixated on static fortresses and paid little heed to the capacity for mobility and adaptability in modern warfare. The result: the Allies burst through, freed France, and went on to march to Berlin. Hitler's fantasy projects. By the end of 1944, Hitler was not just faltering, he was delusional. Instead of defending retreating fronts, he wasted resources on constructing superweapons like the V-2 rocket. He obsessed with phony wonder weapons. Instead of sober strategies, he squandered manpower and material in futile last-stand cities. He was playing like a gambler, chasing his losses, not a general fighting for victory. The strategic impact from Blitzkrieg to burned out the pace of the German military advance was breathtaking, but as it turned out, not sustainable. Hitler played for the shot win. Political will to finance drawn-out war didn't exist. No understanding of supply chains, no grasp of coalition warfare. He believed in fast, crushing victories. He didn't. Then what he had was stubbornness and fantasy and a hope against hope that if you throw enough money at a problem, it will go away. The inheritance of the genius myth. So, why do so many of us continue to believe that Hitler was a military genius? Nazi propaganda depicted him as a new Napoleon. Post-war apologists sought to displace culpability from Hitler onto bad luck or his generals. It dumbs down history into evil genius versus good guys with guns. But make no mistake, Hitler wasn't a strategic genius. He was mistake-prone and hubristic, blinded by ideology. Conclusion: not a strategist, a saboteur. If martial genius is best judged by sustained success, intelligent adaptability, and tactical prescience, Hitler fails on all counts. He took a huge gamble, defied the Eastern Front specialists, and brought Germany to utter destruction. Welcome to Chapter 10 of 10 Common Myths about Hitler, legends you thought were true. Today we're tackling a myth that isn't just about Hitler, it's about history. The myth that it was inevitable. You've heard it already. War was inevitable. Germany was always going to get back on its feet. The Treaty of Versailles made sure of revenge. These are big history truths that have a kind of sweep, but they are, in fact, lazy excuses, a way to avoid responsibility and complexity. Make no mistake, World War II was not inevitable. It wasn't some cosmic accident or a storm that came out of nowhere. It was a series of human decisions, some stupid, some unctuous, some mean, and in the midst of it all was Adolf Hitler, the Versailles scapegoat. Favorite historical punching bag for everyone is the Treaty of Versailles. Signed in 1919, it heavily punished Germany following World War I with a loss of territory, military restrictions and high reparations. Yes, Versailles humiliated Germany. Yes, it created resentment. But was it a design for a Third World War? No. Germany was still one of Europe's largest economies. The Weimar Republic missed these chances to recover and democratize. Other defeated countries, Austria and Hungary, did not wage global wars seeking revenge. If the treaty had been the fuel, though, it was Hitler who struck the match. Myth of a war-loving Germany. Not all Germans wanted war, not even close. The 1920s were an era of widespread pacifism. German youth movements, intellectuals, and even some within the military were leery of another war. But the rise of Hitler appended the equation. Through propaganda, censorship, and political purges, he remade the national psyche. He didn't need to tap into a pre-existing blind war fever. He created it: appeasement, choice, not destiny. One of the most important reasons that World War II occurred, when it did, was appeasement from Britain and France. When Hitler reoccupied the Rhineland in 1936, which was an outright treaty violation, annexation of Austria in 1938, Anschluss asked for and accepted the Sudetenland from Czechoslovakia. Each time the Allies blinked. They had wanted to appease him by giving him what he wanted, but appeasement wasn't inevitable. It was a political choice. Neville Chamberlain and other leaders so wedded to peace that they stifled out consideration of the cost of delay. The others got warnings, like Winston Churchill. They didn't listen. The Lost Summer, Hitler's dangerous dream of a new Reich in 1939 at times. Hitler's hold on power was tenuous. In the early 1930s, as the Nazi Party fragmented, this fractured condition was typical of the party. The 1934 purge was known as the Night of the Long Knives. His economy was shaky and overborrowed. Had foreign powers challenged him? When he remilitarized the Rhineland or meted out economic punishment, immediately it might have imploded the Nazi house of cards at an early stage. But a fear of conflict and an underestimation of Hitler's determination allowed him to spread. Hitler's obsession with warfare, personal obsession of Hitler, is what, more than any treaty, more than any historical trend, drove war forward. He believed Germany required Lebensraum, living space in the East. The Slavs were an inferior people and ought to be dominated. Some of them were that the Jews were plotting a world conspiracy and must be slaughtered. These weren't reactions to Versailles. They were ideological imperatives. Hitler didn't want peace. He wanted conquest. Nor was war a measure of reluctance. It was the final destination. The myth of irresistible forces, the myth inevitable war tends to regard history as a river, one that cannot be diverted. But that is not how human events unfold. Diplomacy could have been stronger. Authoritarianism might conceivably have been resisted before. Democracies could have rearmed faster. Decisions were made at every level. Many made the wrong ones, not that they didn't have options. The danger of the myth to believe that World War II was inevitable is to do more than distort the past. It dims our senses in the now. If we believe that mass violence is inevitable, we cease watching for signals. We stop believing in prevention, and we vastly overrate dangerous people and give them way more credit than they deserve for being fated to rise. History isn't destiny. It's decision after decision after decision, which brings me to concluding a war that needn't have taken place. World War II didn't have to be carved in stone. It wasn't fate. It was born of fear, failure, and the fanaticism of some of the faithful. Hitler wasn't riding a wave of history. He was elbowing other people out of the way to ensure it washed up around him. Understanding that gives us power. Because if war is created by choices, peace can be as well. Welcome to Chapter 11 of 10 Common Myths about Hitler. Legends you thought were true. This time we're applying the wrench to one of the most enduring and oddly flattering myths of the Nazi regime. That it was ruthlessly efficient, a flawlessly organized bureaucracy with German precision at every level. That it's the image we see in movies. Officers in smart uniforms, perfectly coordinated marching ranks, orders carried out with robotic obedience. But beneath the veneer was something much messier: bureaucratic chaos, jockeying for power, duplicated roles, and, at times, jaw-dropping incompetence. The myth of Nazi efficiency has no basis in fact. It is the product of Nazi propaganda, post-war alibis and Hollywood. Cinematography. Time to lift the engine hood and take a peek inside the Nazi situational engine. The overlapping power centers. The Nazi state was not a clean it was a spiderweb of intersecting agencies, all fighting to have the most sway. The SS, which Himmler ran, also intersected with the Gestapo, the Waffen-SS, the police. The Wehrmacht was, to a large extent, an independent arm of the Nazi Party, and sometimes worked against it. No Nazi appointees and ideologues also interfered in civil ministries such as economics, education, etc. Closing parenthesis. Why so much duplication? It didn't happen by accident. It was by design. Hitler thrived on division. He went out of his way to establish competing sources of power so that no faction would get too strong. It ensured militant, submissive loyalty from all. not to Germany. But to him, this wasn't efficiency. It was controlled chaos. Hitler's disinterest in administration. Hitler was consumed by ideology, architecture, and military campaigns, but had no interest in the nuts and bolts of governance. He frequently deferred decisions by letting subordinates scrap them out. He would spare vague instructions, then vanish for days or weeks. He delivered long, rambling monologues instead of having structured meetings. The result: paralysis at the top, endless memos, turf wars, and also important policies held up or botched. Ideology over expertise. Efficiency requires skill. The Nazi regime wiped out most of Germany's educated elite Jews, leftists, intellectuals early on. In their place, they installed party loyalists, lacking relevant experience, dogmatists, more fanatical than interested in results, friends named for loyalty, not talent. Skilled figures like Albert Speer were also frequently hampered by political infighting or sabotaged by competing cliques. When you prize purity above all else, you're systemically screwed. Economic confusion and contradiction. The Nazi economy is often extolled for its supposed miracle, but the reality was a mishmash of contradictory policies and hidden debts. Several agencies had jurisdiction over the same industries. Economic planners found themselves in rivalry for resources with the military. And labor policies were reversed back and forth, according to ideology, not economics. Speer later conceded that a lot of German industry was not being put to full use because of poor coordination. Even so-called free slave labor was mismanaged and proved to be less productive than paid labor. The war machine was a Frankenstein, NULLs, MONST. So Germany's military had always suffered from a lack of organization. The policy of slaughtering non-combatants on occupied territories were constantly undermining those military results. Conflicting priorities among the army, Luftwaffe, and SS. Duplication in the development of weapons, several models of tanks, counterproductive inter-service rivalry that resulted in logistical nightmares. In one absurd case, Germany had more than 50 types of trucks in service, and finding parts and making repairs was a logistical nightmare. That's not genius. That's a junkyard. Propaganda masked the dysfunction. The Goebbels propaganda machine was amazingly good at creating an image of strength, order, and precision. Movies, posters, rallies, they all presented the appearance of unity. Instead, the truth was a regime full of internal sabotage, jealousy, and backstabbing. Goebbels himself was in constant conflict with competing propagandists. Even the SS was divided internally by field commanders and ideological purists. The Holocaust was logistically vast, but morally bankrupt. Some say the Holocaust shows how efficient the Nazis were. It was certainly an enormous, terrifying logistical operation. But even in this case, efficiency is misleading. The final solution was not planned but improvised. It developed from ghettoization through mass shootings to gas chambers. It took relentless trial and error, great swaths of resources, and incredibly meticulous planning. A lot of camps were not designed for sustainability. Records were chaotic. Corruption was rampant. The entire enterprise was fueled by ideological mania rather than logistical mastery. Internal fracture well before external surrender. The German state was already crumbling from within. As early as 1942, morale among troops was plunging. Supply lines were breaking down. Civilian infrastructure was under strain. By 1944, it was a regime that could exist only on fear and inertia. A picture of a well-oiled machine covered a machine that was falling to pieces because of desperation. Conclusion: not a machine. Amazed the Nazi government wasn't finely tuned like a well-oiled machine. It was a mess, a cockeyed maze of ambition, knavery, incompetence, and ideological madness. It worked, not because it was efficient, it was brutal. It worked for a bit, not because it was clever, but because it was brutal. Welcome to Chapter 12 of 10 Common Myths about Hitler. Legends you thought you knew. Today, we're plunging into the rabbit hole, the conspiracy that won't quit, the legend of how Adolf Hitler somehow escaped Berlin in 1945 and lived out the rest of his days in Argentina, Antarctica, a U-boat, or whatever you feel like. It's tabloid gold, secret tunnels, lookalikes, e-boats, full of Nazis bound for South America. The claims have been spun into entire seasons of shows like Hunting Hitler. But what's the truth? Spoiler alert, Hitler died in the bunker in Berlin in April 1945. So, let's separate fact from fiction, corpse from conspiracy. The Endgame, the inside story of the struggle for Iraq, from George W. Bush to Barack Obama. By April 1945, Berlin was encircled. The city was being bombarded by the Soviets. Hitler was holed up in the concrete tomb beneath the Reich Chancellery, known as the Vorbunker. It was there, on April 30th, that he and his mistress Eva Braun killed themselves, Hitler by a gunshot to the head and Braun by cyanide. Their bodies were covered in petrol and set alight as he had instructed. The bodies were buried in a shallow shell hole by SS guards. A number of eyewitnesses, Hitler's own valet, secretaries, military officials, related the story in consistent fashion. The escape theory, dead on arrival, the Soviet secrecy that fed the fire, so why all the confusion? The Soviets, who found the remains, were playing it close to the vest. At first, Stalin insisted to the Allies that they had not discovered Hitler's body. This stoked Western paranoia and the early Cold War propaganda machine. In fact, they had teeth, a fragment of skull and jawbone, which were later combined with dental work that matched Hitler's dental records by his personal dentist and dental assistant. Since they don't want to share certain intel, conspiracy theorists have all the oxygen they need. The escape to Argentina myth, the most persistent. Hitler escaped to Argentina, where he lived peacefully in a rural village among other Nazis. So he didn't want us to cover the fact that he had grown old, peacefully, had even sired offspring. So, who knows? Evidence. 0. No credible witness. No verified photos, no papers, no bodies, no trails. What there was in Argentina. Nazis. Many of senior officers such as Eichmann and Mengele did go there and escape there, with the aid of the likes of Odessa and the Vatican Lens. The fact that he had helped feed the fantasy that Hitler had joined them. But Hitler was the best-known man in history. He could not fade into the society as Eichmann had. DNA and forensics. Case closed in 2000. A fragment of Hitler's jawbone stored in Moscow was tested against the extensive dental records kept by his personal dental team. They matched perfectly. In 2018, a French team studied the skull fragment, which is also kept in Russian archives. The DNA indicated that it was from a woman. But that is not the point. The jaw is key, and the jaw is conclusive. If Hitler got away, he left his teeth behind. 9. He didn't. Why the myth won't die easy. People want to believe in a conspiracy, especially the kind that makes evil seem all around, relentless and larger than life. It adds drama, it produces thrillers, and clickbait. It plays on suspicion of government and institutions. Some people simply don't like a tidy ending. They need Hitler to be the monster that may return, because that's scarier than accepting that he died a coward's death in a bunker underground. Pop culture fictions and reinforcements with shows like Hunting Hitler, evidence-free documentaries, and sensationalist books have blurred the line between theory and truth. What starts as what if rapidly devolves into maybe he did, and then he definitely survived. But speculation is not history, and entertainment is not the same thing as evidence. The real danger of the myth is not simply a crank theory. Believing Hitler got away does three dangerous things. It adds nothing to the true sources of Nazism. It turns history into fantasy. It allows revisionists to doubt other well-documented atrocities. The truth is clear. He died. His regime ended. The horror was no figment of an author's fertile imagination, and it culminated in Berlin. Conclusion. Bury the man, bury the myth. Hitler didn't escape. He didn't flee to Argentina. He didn't live to be 100. He perished in a bunker, a shattered man in a hellscape of ash and ruin. The survival theories are comfort lies wrapped up as curiosity, but the facts are in. The case is closed. The body is laid to rest in history, if not in peace. Welcome to the last chapter of our serial. 10 common myths about Hitler, legends you thought were true. Now you have met the myths, dissected the lies, and looked the ugly truths in the eye. But here's the bigger question. So what? Who cares if people continue to believe Hitler was a vegetarian or military genius, or he escaped to Argentina? It matters because myths about Hitler are not merely misleading in a historical sense, they also sow wasteful confusion in our politics and culture to this day. They make evil seem glamorous. They are rubes at the hands of tyrants. They let us off the hook. making it easier for us to evade responsibility by attributing decisions to the impersonal forces of fate or history, instead of individuals. The lasting legacies of these myths aren't just in textbooks or documentaries. It is in politics, in culture, and in the daily decisions we all face about truth, memory, and responsibility. Let's finish this the right way. Myth as armor for extremism. There's a myth around Hitler, and it's a myth that sanitizes the horror. If he were a genius, yes, maybe fascism works. If he was a misunderstood artist, maybe authoritarianism isn't so bad. If he was beloved by the people, well, populist authoritarians have their historical precedents. These myths provide cover for contemporary extremists who seek to rebrand tyranny as order, brutality as strength, and propaganda as patriotism. To let those myths stand makes for a head start for the next Hitler. When we glorify the villain, we forget the victims each time. We paint an image of Hitler being a tactical genius or emphasize his supposed charm. We risk obliterating the story of the millions who suffered and died. Myth-making changes the focus of attention from Auschwitz to architectural plans, from genocide to uniforms. Remember, Hitler didn't just pulverize cities, he obliterated families, futures, entire cultures. The victims deserve to be more than a footnote in a myth about his style or supposed genius. A lesson from history, not reassurance, but caution. The truth about Hitler's actual legacy is not comfortable. It's not supposed to be. History, in other words, is the ghost we must embrace if we hope to be haunted in a different way. If we hope to have the past shake us and make us wake up to how easily fear and hate can be turned into policy. The myths provide comfort. That could never happen again. The truth provides warning. It could, and here's how it begins. Why it's scarier, and more. The 11th of September 20. The reality is that Hitler wasn't an otherworldly creature, or a demon. He was human, flawed, hateful, strategic in patches, but more reckless for the most part. Charismatic for some, but based on fear, propaganda and violence. That's terrifying, since it means history didn't have to have a supervillain to scorch the earth. It only required maybe some people to believe some wrong things at some wrong time. Fighting myths is fighting amnesia. The past doesn't repeat, it rhymes. Myths are like earplugs that dampen warning bells. As we refute these stories, we hone our memory. We remember not only what happened, but how. And that will make it harder for history to surprise us yet again. The responsibility of remembering. We can't afford lazy history. Not in textbooks. Not in classrooms. Not in media. Not online. Call out romanticized portrayals. Question the memes, the quotes, the fun facts. Push back on oversimplifications. There is a moral reckoning that Hitler's legacy fits into, not mystery, not myth, much less the sort of admiration that finds its way into bestseller lists. Conclusion: shatter the myth, protect the future. The past isn't all there is to history. It's a mirror, and sometimes a warning sign. Hitler's narrative, stripped of myth, is a bloody reminder of what fear, indifference, and uncritical devotion can unleash. The reality may be messier, but it is our best defense, so don't settle for myth. Challenge it, question it. There is something, replace it with something stronger. Facts, context, humanity. That is, if we don't make the real lessons of history, we may be doomed to repeat its darkest passages. Thanks so much for listening to this deep dive. Remain curious, remain skeptical, and remain awake.